free speech and hate speech and regulating speech. Because controlling speech is one of the major things that is becoming news within the past few years, controlling what you're allowed to say on the internet and who's responsible for it. So it's all about controlling the flow of information. Okay, good, I got to use that. All right, so yeah, free speech and hate speech. First off, what is free speech? What is hate speech? What do we mean by free speech? You say anything you want.
First Amendment.
Yeah, so complete free speech is you can say whatever you want, however you want, to whoever you want. No society that's ever existed has had complete free speech. So, down at this end, with complete free speech, I have what I'm calling my libertarian fantasy world. So, this is not a society that has ever existed. No society has ever existed that's allowed you to say anything you want to anybody you want. There are some limits everywhere. On the other end, you can imagine a society that has absolutely no free speech whatsoever. And what we could imagine is in an extreme case, you can imagine that you have to have a computer chip in your brain which controls what comes out of your mouth. That would be no society has ever had that much control over its citizens. No one has ever had that much control. That's a sci-fi surveillance state fantasy world. So those are the two extremes on the free speech realm. So the question you need to ask yourself with free speech is just how much is good? Because why don't we want a world in which you're allowed to say, well, we all know why you don't want a world in which your brain is controlled by a computer chip. We can all understand nobody wants that to be controlled by something at all times. But what's the problem with a society in which you can say whatever, however, whoever to anyone you want? What's the worry with that sort of system?
The problem is that there are going to be a lot of, how should I put it? Well, there will be certainly calls to violence and there will be widespread, but what is good in that is that they will be easily trackable and then easily put.
Yeah, so the thing you can imagine though is, if you have a society in which everyone says anything goes and nobody regulates and nobody comes along to regulate you, what you would have is a society in which people would call other people to violence and no one would do anything about it. Or you could say anything to anybody, no matter the consequences, and it would lead to problems.
Yeah, it's kind of like what I was kind of hinting at my point earlier when I was saying freedom of speech is kind of one of the things that's not regulated. Theoretically speaking, we do have the most freedom to say whatever we want. Because if you think about it in theory, what would really stop people from saying what they wanted besides, who you're saying into?
Yeah. So here's the thing: is in a complete libertarian fantasy world, you're allowed to scream fire in a crowded room. You're allowed to say we should all kill this person, and no one would say anything about it. We, though, in the United States, are not quite on this extreme. We fall where on this scale? We can pick if here's the 50% mark, which side are we on? We're somewhere over here, I think. I don't know where to put us exactly. Let's just put here. The US is falling somewhere on this side, where there are certain things you are allowed to say, a lot of things you're allowed to say, and some things you're not allowed to say, like screaming fire in a crowded room, screaming you're not allowed to scream bomb in a crowded room. Certain types of things you just aren't allowed to scream. Yeah. There are also things that you aren't allowed to do in certain locations, like you aren't allowed to lie where? In a court of law. That is, you're not allowed to say whatever you want in a court of law. There are definitely rules around it, which is why we fall around here. Now there are, however, certain types of things that by the US you're allowed to say and do, which are not allowed elsewhere in the world. So, what are some things that you're allowed to say and do in the United States, which you aren't allowed to say and do elsewhere? Anyone know?
Criticize the government?
Yeah, you're allowed to criticize your government. You're allowed to say whatever you want to say about the president other than actively threatening his life and saying things in part of a plan of threatening his life. That is not allowed. But there are other places, much more over on this side, where you are not allowed by law to criticize your government, and you might be arrested or even killed for it. So we've got more authoritarian states. Also, another reason why the United States is over on this side is because we do have some degrees of surveillance in this country watching what you say. So there's a big push right now to have all student, high school and under student emails read by automatic like checks to check and see if any students are planning school violence or anything else. So here's a way in which, like, on the one hand, you might be like, okay, well that's good because students who are saying like suicidal things to their friends on the school email will be contacted and maybe gotten help. But on the other side, it is the case that most like middle schoolers are just having all their communications read by a machine at all times. And that's like, this is not a fantasy world, like this stuff is happening right now. Also like, so how is it that Google is taking over the, like Google is made a brilliant play for being the next generation's go-to computers in all ways. How have they done this? Does anyone know if you went into an elementary school classroom right now, what you'd see everywhere? But it wouldn't be iPads, it would be Google Chromebooks.
And
Google is getting, like, providing like the little cheap computers. Like they're making a lot of deals with schools to supply the schools for very low prices with these computers so that you get the kids hooked. So like when they think word processing, they think Google Docs. When they think in email, they only think Gmail. When they think, because that's what they've been using since they were like 5. So this is the way that Google's literally like training small children to be Google users. The other fun thing about it is that they're also collecting huge amounts of data on these children who are using their Chromebooks, which is also a thing, like what are the next generation into? What sorts of things are going to get their attention? So that's the other thing. But yeah, so these are the sorts of ways in which the US is not fully this complete libertarian fantasy world, but it's certainly like you're allowed to criticize the US government. What are some other things that you're allowed to do in the United States which you aren't allowed to say elsewhere? Anyone know?
Protest.
Pardon?
Protest.
Yeah, there are certain types of
Oh,
protests
yeah,
that get along
riots.
with authoritarians. That you're allowed to arrange groups of. You're allowed to say like, let us all get together at 3 p.m. in this square, and we will all like carry banners together and protest. You're not allowed to do that in a lot of parts of the world. Right now in Hong Kong, there's literally like you are not allowed to gather together in groups of more than, I can't remember, whatever very small number of people. Like it is illegal to have more than like 10 people together in a grouping in Hong Kong right now. So those are sorts of cases. What are some ones though that like, if we're putting it more in the middle, like these are extreme cases, what are some other things though that you're allowed to just even say in the United States that aren't necessarily allowed, not even like in a strong authoritarian state, but even in places that you think of as quite like free speechy? Am I allowed, if I wanted to, on my own personal Twitter page, post neo-Nazi things, white supremacist things, claims that people of a certain race are better than another race? Am I allowed to do that in the United States?
Yeah.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
Is it like that everywhere?
No.
You are not allowed to, in Germany, you are not allowed to post neo-Nazi things. If you post a neo-Nazi message on Twitter, Twitter is legally obligated to take it down in 15 minutes, or else they will get fined. So this is the sort of thing that exists elsewhere. So like the EU and British regulations fall more, I think the British regulations are closer to the US, but like pure EU regulations fall almost like somewhere in this region. And so what we have is, there are different degrees of regulation here.
I guess in that case, then you can't say like slurs against gay people and lesbian people.
And there's, the thing is, and here's the issue with this sort of stuff, is I'm not actually sure, like in the United States, generally we have such an emphasis on free speech through the First Amendment that much hate speech is legal. It's just either frowned upon or against the terms of service of a company that you're working with. So like Facebook can come along and say you're not allowed to post this. and then they can like kick you off their service. But the government isn't gonna come along. Like if you use some type of slur towards someone on the streets, you just call them a slur, they're generally, you are not gonna be found, like, it's not gonna be deemed illegal. Now, you can, if you're using it in a workplace to make an unsafe workplace environment, then you can get in trouble for it, because it's in, like in a private space and it goes into discrimination law. But generally, like in the United States, if you're posting on a personal website or blog, you're allowed to do just about anything you want. So, let's just open it up. So, in this sort of case, first off, in the United States, what is the main thing which determines that we're allowed to say just about anything we want? We've already said it a couple times. Come on. Free speech of the First Amendment, yeah. First Amendment free speech. First Amendment has basically says you're allowed to do, say and do whatever you want, more or less. Or at the very least, not make bomb threats. Like, you're also not allowed to make bomb threats in the United States, that's against the law. But you're allowed to say, like, just express your opinion on anything. So, what are the pros? Let's just go straight up. What are the pros of having the First Amendment? Why is it there? Why is it that Americans are very, very, generally as a whole, partial to it, and we feel strongly positive towards it?
It allows the free exchange of ideas and fosters pluralism.
Yeah, exactly. So part of it is like, if everyone's allowed to say what they want, then everyone is allowed to exchange and talk to each other. And that is just something which is like a nation that has been, you know, people from all over the world with all sorts of different histories come from and end up in the same place. There's this strong emphasis on people being allowed to say what's on their mind and exchange ideas, and if people are coming at things from different perspectives, just coming together and talking about what their different perspectives are. That's the positive side of it. What are the problems with free speech, though? Why is it that, while free speech has all these positives, you also look at it and you're like, wait a second, there are certain things that I'm not so sure I love about free speech. So what sorts of things make you kind of uncomfortable with free speech? And we all have them. Like, on the whole, I think we are all probably, as US citizens, partial to free speech on the whole, while also recognizing that sometimes it's exploited in ways which we might not like.
To me, it's like you kind of like free speech as long as it doesn't offend you. When it's offend you, it doesn't matter how good is free speech is, you're not gonna like it.
Yeah, and that's the big thing, is one issue with free speech is that it does allow people to say terribly offensive things to each other. And on the plus side, it's kind of that thing of, if you're gonna start saying you can't say offensive things, you're kind of already closing off the box. It's hard to describe the line between what's offensive and what's not offensive, because everyone is offended by different sorts of things. So if you start saying you can't say offensive stuff, you very quickly are having to get rid of a whole lot of things which you are like, now it's just the political correctness police coming along. And like, all of us think there's some degree of things that might offend someone which I should be allowed to say. Like, for instance, if I just like hated the letter S and it like caused my skin to crawl and it caused me incredible discomfort, like what's the correct response if you find out that this is a fact about me? What do you say to me? You tell me to go see a therapist and get help, because I'm not going to be able to go around in the world and make sure nobody ever says the letter S. Like, if I get offended by that, that sounds like it's a me thing that I need to look into. And so there are clearly going to be cases where that's too far. Like, we can't just like throw out everything because it offends someone. But at the same time, it does seem like certain types of things we want to be able to throw out. Like, it does seem like certain types of things which are maybe a threat, maybe just a racial slur, it seems like maybe we don't want that to be able to be said. And that's what the issue with free speech is.
Just to clarify on your position in regards to free speech and hate speech, insults are considered part of free speech because it's very difficult to distinguish between the two, and also hate speech has such an amorphous definition. It's so unclear that oftentimes hate speech is literally formalized to the calls to violence, physical threats or threats of death.
Yeah, and here's the big thing, is on the one hand you have an insult. And insults, like if I call you like a stupid poopy pants or something like that, that is an insult which I'm allowed to call anybody in this classroom that I want a stupid poopy pants, so long as it's not making it an unpleasant work environment for you. Like I might violate John Jay rules, but if we were on the street and you were a stranger and I walked up to you and called you a stupid poopy pants, then I wouldn't be it's just an insult, and it's my First Amendment right to do so. But on the other side, we have harm speech. Harm speech is things like calls to arms, of like, everyone bring your guns and meet here at this time because we're going to go shoot some fill in the blank of whatever racial slur you want. That is something which is not allowed because it's literally designed to cause harm to people. You're not allowed to post on the bulletin board at John Jay, here's how to make a homemade bomb. That sort of stuff. So over here, you have harm speech. And the issue is the line between harm speech and insult is where hate speech falls, and it's very unclear where to put hate speech. Because sometimes it seems like it's more an insult, other times it seems much more like it is designed to make people feel afraid, it is designed to make people feel less than human, and it's designed to literally cause people emotional harm. And that's why it's so tough with free speech, and different nations, depending on their histories, put it in a different place. So, for instance, why is it that in the United States, we allow neo-Nazi speech, but in say, Germany they don't? What's the major historical difference here?
It didn't happen here.
Yeah, where was the Holocaust?
Germany.
In Germany, it was carried out there. That is why there are much stricter rules. In the United States, we did not go through that. So we are much more willing to allow certain types of things. And so that's what we kind of see here, is the line between hate speech or harm speech and insult, different people fall on different sides. And this is a problem with the internet, because what has the internet fundamentally changed about hate speech? The words that we use today are the same historically, like take the N-word. The N-word is a word which has been around for hundreds of years, more or less the same as it is today. Only, what is the major difference now when people throw that word around? If 100 years ago, if you used the N-word, who would hear you use the N-word? How many people? Not that many, because how far could your use of the N-word be heard?
You surround it.
Yeah, however far your voice could travel. Now, when somebody uses it, who can hear it? Everybody worldwide. And that's the major difference here, is because when we talk about, like, if we're going from harm to insult, an insult, if you say it to one person alone on a street, the only person you're talking to is that one person. You can cause them, like, emotional distress, but it's not changing, like, the nature of the world. But if you have a person who can access millions of people with their voice and say harmful things and hurt so many people and make them feel unsafe, or make a whole group of people who can interpret that as proof that certain things need to happen, that is a very, very different game. So when somebody uses an insulting word or says these people are worse than those people, if they have 20 million Twitter followers, that's 20 million people who are hearing them say that. That is a totally different animal. And so that's why free speech is becoming such an issue again, is even if it was the president 100 years ago saying racist things, not that many people would have heard the president say that. Nowadays, if the president says hateful or racist things, billions of people hear it. And that's the fundamental difference here.
I think also, like, what he was saying about it being offensive, like, I think like on top of that, like, it's just like the matter of how offensive it is, but how other people are gonna, like, where the line gets drawn into the offensiveness of, I don't know if that's the right word, but
No, that is the right word.
but of it, you know?
And that's exactly the thing. So how many of you, and this is also a test of whether you're asleep, how many of you have said something to a close friend which you would never have said in public? We've all done it. UD, whatever's on your phone, you've done it too. No, I'm kidding. But I'm only busting your chops because we have a good rapport, don't worry. Yeah, that's the thing. We know what counts as offensive depends on the audience. And what's the other thing about the internet now? Who are you communicating with? Everyone worldwide, many of whom have a very different history from you and have gone through different things than you. And what you and your friends might think is just a funny joke might be genuinely offensive to somebody. And while your friend might laugh it off and be like, I don't mind that, and you both could be like, he was only kidding, she was only kidding. The fact is that if somebody's hearing that from a very different perspective, and what you said could be very hurtful to them, and that's the other issue, is what you might interpret as a joking insult, somebody else might think is literally putting them in harm. And that is another issue with free speech and the internet. And so this is like, the thing about the internet and free speech and why this is such a big deal is that there is really, it's just opening up new questions and causing problems that have been around for a long time, but have just changed the game in new ways. Things which used to seem like ordinary insults because everyone was working with the same background assumptions you were, are now moving all over the place. And you have people, and this is why people are getting so mad at like the quote unquote, political correctness speech. It's like, well, I used to be able to say that with my buddies all the time. And it's like, yeah, but you're not just with your buddies anymore, and the nature of the technology is such that you are working with a different audience all the time.
Yeah, 'cause I was gonna say, like, if it was the point where like everything, if everything that we said that was offensive just didn't offend anybody, like, or like it offended them but it didn't make them like offended to the point where they wanted to go do something about it, like,
Yeah.
then it wouldn't be an issue. But so I think that's why it's like something that we have to regulate, because not because of it, like, that's the point I was trying to make. I agree, like, the principle is that it is offensive and people are saying it, but I think why we have to be regulated though is because is that people aren't, that's how it's making people feel. Like,
Yeah, exactly. So like, when you think about something which gets said on the news about, or like what is the difference now between like somebody saying a white supremacist thing with their buddies at a bar 20 years ago to now having a white supremacist blog? What is they're both covered by First Amendment rights. What is the difference, and why is it that we now think maybe we need to regulate this more than we used to? What is the push here? Or like, should we just leave it as is and be like, this is the same First Amendment we've always had? What is the reason why people are starting to think maybe we do need to regulate or change this?
I think it's kind of hard to regulate too, because imagine you saying something, right? It could be offensive to me, but it could not be offensive to other people. So imagine liberal people saying something, it could be offensive to conservative. And conservative people saying something like Trump saying something, but a million people supporting him. So it's kind of hard to draw that line, which offensive
and I
and which
think
is
that's the real point here. And the idea before was that like, because somebody could be offended by something, we don't need to put anything in place, just everything as long as you're within the realm of not harm speech. The difference, I think, though, is that now because so many people are hearing these things, and not only that, is one of the major worries, like when people point out like racist language being used by public figures, it's not just that the fact is that this person is saying something which harms a lot of, offends a lot of people. What's the bigger problem? What is it that people, so when Trump says something like all Mexicans are criminals, it wasn't just that was highly offensive. What was the other issue with it?
many people supported it.
So a lot of people supported it, and Raul.
The fact that he's our president.
Yeah, you have a person in a position of power saying that, who's saying something which now, it's now acceptable, like it or not, people who are public figures, when they say something, people listen. Like, there are reasons why, like, if Justin Bieber says something dumb, people will actually still listen to his opinion on it. Or like, when people get interviewed on things they have no idea about, the fact is that if they're a public figure, people are interested in what they have to say. Like, there's a reason why LeBron James, as the face of the NBA, people ask him questions about social issues. And that's just a fact of the world now, is if you're a public figure, people want to know your opinion. And what your opinion is can sway people and change what becomes acceptable. And when you find a lot of these people who are committing like hate crimes and like mass shootings at mosques or synagogues will point to things said by public figures as inspiring them to do these things. And that's the worry. So you might, like Donald Trump might think, like when he says this hateful thing about Mexicans, he's just making a point. It's like, oh, I'm just throwing that offhand. But the line between just saying something and it being a call to arms is very blurry. Like when you have somebody who goes into Texas, like El Paso, Texas, and shoots up a mostly Latino community and says, I did this because I know that all Mexicans are criminals. Like, was it now that Trump, because so many people can hear his message, is it now that that message, which used to just be hate speech, has moved into a call to arms or harm speech? And that's what the internet has fundamentally changed, is what used to just be a plain old case of free speech, First Amendment rights, is starting to be something different because of the nature of how we can talk to each other around the world. And that's really why these sorts of things, and that's why the EU has moved in more and more strict directions, which for better and worse. And this is the issue, is like, so what is an example of an authoritarian state that cracks down hard on this stuff? Like there are certain things you cannot say, you cannot read, you cannot access. China. The Chinese government is very strict about what you have access to. And that has positive